What Uncle Sam Really Wants. Book by Noam Chomsky. Audiobook by the Learner's Library. Contents. Part 3. Brainwashing at Home. A. How the Cold War Worked. B. The War on Certain Drugs. C. War is Peace. Freedom is Slavery. D. Ignorance is Strength. E. Socialism, Real and Fake. F. The Media. Part 3. Brainwashing at Home. How the Cold War Worked. Despite much pretense, national security has not been a major concern of U.S. planners and elected officials. The historical record reveals this clearly. Few serious analysts took issue with George Kennan's position that it is not Russian military power which is threatening us, it is Russian political power, October 1947, or with President Eisenhower's consistent view that the Russians intended no military conquest of Western Europe and that the major role of NATO was to convey a feeling of confidence to exposed populations, a confidence which will make them sturdier, politically, in their opposition to communist inroads. Similarly, the U.S. dismissed possibilities for a peaceful resolution of the Cold War conflict, which would have left the political threat intact. In his History of Nuclear Weapons, McGeorge Bundy writes that he is aware of no serious contemporary proposal that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement before they were ever deployed, even though these were the only potential military threat to the U.S. It was always the political threat of so-called communism that was the primary concern. Recall that communism is a broad term and includes all those with the ability to get control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate. As Secretary of State John Foster Dulles privately complained to his brother Alan, CIA director, "The poor people are the ones they appeal to," he added. "And they have always wanted to plunder the rich. So they must be overcome, to protect our doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor." Of course, both the US and USSR would have preferred that the other simply disappear. But since this would obviously have involved mutual annihilation, a system of global management called the Cold War was established. According to the conventional view, the Cold War was a conflict between two superpowers, caused by Soviet aggression, in which we tried to contain the Soviet Union and protect the world from it. If this view is a doctrine of theology, there's no need to discuss it. If it is intended to shed some light on history, we can easily put it to the test, bearing in mind a very simple point. If you want to understand the Cold War, you should look at the events of the Cold War. If you do so, a very different picture emerges. On the Soviet side, the events of the Cold War were repeated interventions in Eastern Europe, tanks in East Berlin and Budapest and Prague. These interventions took place along the route that was used to attack and virtually destroy Russia 3 times in this century alone. The invasion of Afghanistan is the one example of an intervention outside that route, though also on the Soviet border. On the U.S. side, intervention was worldwide, reflecting the status attained by the U.S. as the first truly global power in history. On the domestic front, the Cold War helped the Soviet Union entrench its military bureaucratic ruling class in power, and it gave the U.S. a way to compel its population to subsidize high-tech industry. It isn't easy to sell that to the domestic populations. The technique used was the old standby fear of a great enemy. The Cold War provided that too. No matter how outlandish the idea that the Soviet Union and its tentacles were strangling the West, the evil empire was in fact evil, was an empire, and was brutal. Each superpower controlled its primary enemy, its own population, by terrifying it with the, quite real, crimes of the other. In crucial respects, then, The Cold War was a kind of tacit arrangement between the Soviet Union and the United States, under which the U.S. conducted its wars against the Third World and controlled its allies in Europe, while the Soviet rulers kept an iron grip on their own internal empire and their satellites in Eastern Europe, each side using the other to justify repression and violence in its own domains. So why did the Cold War end, and how does its end change things? By the 1970s, Soviet military expenditures were leveling off, and internal problems were mounting, with economic stagnation and increasing pressures for an end to tyrannical rule. Soviet power internationally had, in fact, been declining for some 30 years, as a study by the Center for Defense Information showed in 1980. A few years later, the Soviet system had collapsed. The Cold War ended with the victory of what had always been the far richer and more powerful contestant. The Soviet collapse was part of the more general economic catastrophe of the 1980s, more severe in most of the Third World domains of the West than in the Soviet Empire. As we've already seen, the Cold War had significant elements of North-South conflict, to use the contemporary euphemism for the European conquest of the world. Much of the Soviet Empire had formerly been quasi-colonial dependencies of the West. The Soviet Union took an independent course, providing assistance to targets of Western attack and deterring the worst of Western violence. With the collapse of Soviet tyranny, much of the region can be expected to return to its traditional status, with the former higher echelons of the bureaucracy playing the role of the Third World elites that enrich themselves while serving the interests of foreign investors. But while this particular phase has ended, North-South conflicts continue. One side may have called off the game, but the U.S. is proceeding as before, more freely, in fact, with Soviet deterrence a thing of the past. It should have surprised no one that George Bush celebrated the symbolic end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, by immediately invading Panama and announcing loud and clear that the U.S. would subvert Nicaragua's election, by maintaining its economic stranglehold and military attack unless our side won. Nor did it take great insight for Elliott Abrams to observe that the U.S. invasion of Panama was unusual because it could be conducted without fear of a Soviet reaction anywhere, or for numerous commentators during the Gulf crisis to add that the U.S. and Britain were now free to use unlimited force against its Third World enemy, since they were no longer inhibited by the Soviet deterrent. Of course, the end of the Cold War brings its problems too. Notably, the technique for controlling the domestic population has had to shift, a problem recognized through the 1980s, as we've already seen. New enemies have to be invented. It becomes harder to disguise the fact that the real enemy has always been the poor who seek to plunder the rich, in particular, Third World miscreants who seek to break out of the service role. The war on certain drugs. One substitute for the disappearing evil empire has been the threat of drug traffickers from Latin America. In early September 1989, a major government media blitz was launched by the president. That month the AP wires carried more stories about drugs than about Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa combined. If you looked at television, every news program had a big section on how drugs were destroying our society, becoming the greatest threat to our existence, etc. The effect on public opinion was immediate. When Bush won the 1988 election, people said the budget deficit was the biggest problem facing the country. Only about 3% named drugs. After the media blitz, concern over the budget was way down, and drugs had soared to about 40% or 45%, which is highly unusual for an open question, where no specific answers are suggested. Now, when some client state complains that the US government isn't sending it enough money, they no longer say, "We need it to stop the Russians," rather, "We need it to stop drug trafficking." Like the Soviet threat, this enemy provides a good excuse for a US military presence where there's rebel activity or other unrest. So internationally, the war on drugs provides a cover for intervention. Domestically, it has little to do with drugs but a lot to do with distracting the population, increasing repression in the inner cities, and building support for the attack on civil liberties. That's not to say that substance abuse isn't a serious problem. At the time the drug war was launched, deaths from tobacco were estimated at about 300,000 a year, with perhaps another 100,000 from alcohol. But these aren't the drugs the Bush administration targeted. It went after illegal drugs, which had caused many fewer deaths, over 3,500 a year, according to official figures. One reason for going after these drugs was that their use had been declining for some years, so the Bush administration could safely predict that its drug war would succeed in lowering drug use. The administration also targeted marijuana, which hadn't caused any known deaths among some 60 million users. In fact, that crackdown has exacerbated the drug problem. Many marijuana users have turned from this relatively harmless drug to more dangerous drugs like cocaine, which are easier to conceal. Just as the drug war was launched with great fanfare in September 1989, the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, panel held a hearing in Washington to consider a tobacco industry request that the U.S. impose sanctions on Thailand, in retaliation for its efforts to restrict U.S. tobacco imports and advertising. Such U.S. government actions had already rammed this lethal addictive narcotic down the throats of consumers in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, with human costs of the kind already indicated. The U.S. Surgeon General, Everett Koop, testified at the USTR panel that, when we are pleading with foreign governments to stop the flow of cocaine, it is the height of hypocrisy for the United States to export tobacco. He added, years from now, our nation will look back on this application of free trade policy and find it scandalous. Thai witnesses also protested, predicting that the consequence of U.S. sanctions would be to reverse a decline in smoking achieved by their government's campaign against tobacco use. Responding to the U.S. tobacco company's claim that their product is the best in the world, a Thai witness said, "Certainly in the Golden Triangle we have some of the best products, but we never ask the principle of free trade to govern such products. In fact, we suppressed them." Critics recalled the Opium War 150 years earlier, when the British government compelled China to open its doors to opium from British India, sanctimoniously pleading the virtues of free trade as they forcefully imposed large-scale drug addiction on China. Here we have the biggest drug story of the day. Imagine the screaming headlines, U.S. government the world's leading drug peddler. It would surely sell papers. But the story passed virtually unreported, and with not a hint of the obvious conclusions. Another aspect of the drug problem, which also received little attention, is the leading role of the U.S. government in stimulating drug trafficking since World War II. This happened in part when the U.S. began its post-war task of undermining the anti-fascist resistance, and the labor movement became an important target. In France, the threat of the political power and influence of the labor movement was enhanced by its steps to impede the flow of arms to French forces seeking to reconquer their former colony of Vietnam with U.S. aid. So the CIA undertook to weaken and split the French labor movement, with the aid of top American labor leaders, who were quite proud of their role. The task required strikebreakers and goons. There was an obvious supplier, the mafia. Of course, They didn't take on this work just for the fun of it. They wanted a return for their efforts. And it was given to them. They were authorized to re-establish the heroin racket that had been suppressed by the fascist governments, the famous French Connection that dominated the drug trade until the 1960s. By then, the center of the drug trade had shifted to Indochina, particularly Laos and Thailand. The shift was again a byproduct of a CIA operation, the secret war, fought in those countries during the Vietnam War by a CIA mercenary army. They also wanted a payoff for their contributions. Later, as the CIA shifted its activities to Pakistan and Afghanistan, the drug racket boomed there. The clandestine war against Nicaragua also provided a shot in the arm to drug traffickers in the region, as illegal CIA arms flights to the U.S. mercenary forces offered an easy way to ship drugs back to the U.S., sometimes through U.S. Air Force bases, traffickers report. The close correlation between the drug racket and international terrorism, sometimes called counterinsurgency, low-intensity conflict, or some other euphemism, is not surprising. Clandestine operations need plenty of money, which should be undetectable. And they need criminal operatives as well. The rest follows. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. The terms of political discourse typically have two meanings. One is the dictionary meaning, and the other is a meaning that is useful for serving power, the doctrinal meaning. Take democracy. According to the common sense meaning, a society is democratic to the extent that people can participate in a meaningful way in managing their affairs. But the doctrinal meaning of democracy is different. It refers to a system in which decisions are made by sectors of the business community and related elites. The public is to be only spectators of action, not participants, as leading democratic theorists, in this case, Walter Lippmann, have explained. They are permitted to ratify the decisions of their betters and to lend their support to one or another of them, but not to interfere with matters, like public policy, that are none of their business. If segments of the public depart from their apathy and begin to organize and enter the public arena, that's not democracy. Rather, it's a crisis of democracy in proper technical usage, a threat that has to be overcome in one way or another. In El Salvador, by death squads, at home, by more subtle and indirect means. Or take free enterprise, a term that refers, in practice, to a system of public subsidy and private profit, with massive government intervention in the economy to maintain a welfare state for the rich. In fact, in acceptable usage, just about any phrase containing the word free is likely to mean something like the opposite of its actual meaning. Or take the term defense against aggression, a phrase that's used, predictably, to refer to aggression. When the U.S. attacked South Vietnam in the early 1960s, the liberal hero Adlai Stevenson, among others, explained that we were defending South Vietnam against internal aggression, that is, the aggression of South Vietnamese peasants against the U.S. Air Force and a U.S.-run mercenary army, which were driving them out of their homes and into concentration camps where they could be protected from the southern guerrillas. In fact, these peasants willingly supported the guerrillas, while the U.S. client regime was an empty shell, as was agreed on all sides. So magnificently has the doctrinal system risen to its task that to this day, 30 years later, the idea that the U.S. attacked South Vietnam is unmentionable, even unthinkable, in the mainstream. The essential issues of the war are, correspondingly, beyond any possibility of discussion now. The guardians of political correctness, the real PC, can be quite proud of an achievement that would be hard to duplicate in a well-run totalitarian state. Or take the term peace process. The naive might think that it refers to efforts to seek peace. Under this meaning, we would say that the peace process in the Middle East includes, for example, the offer of a full peace treaty to Israel by President Sadat of Egypt in 1971, along lines advocated by virtually the entire world, including official U.S. policy. The Security Council resolution of January 1976 introduced by the major Arab states, with the backing of the PLO, which called for a two-state settlement of the Arab-Israel conflict in the terms of a near-universal international consensus. PLO offers through the 1980s to negotiate with Israel for mutual recognition, and annual votes at the UN General Assembly, most recently in December 1990, voted 144-2, calling for an international conference on the Israel-Arab problem, etc. But the sophisticated understand that these efforts do not form part of the peace process. The reason is that in the PC meaning, the term peace process refers to what the U.S. government is doing. In the cases mentioned, this is to block international efforts to seek peace. The cases cited do not fall within the peace process because the U.S. backed Israel's rejection of Sadat's offer, vetoed the Security Council resolution, opposed negotiations and mutual recognition of the PLO and Israel, and regularly joins with Israel in opposing, thereby, in effect, vetoing, any attempt to move towards a peaceful diplomatic settlement at the UN or elsewhere. The peace process is restricted to U.S. initiatives, which call for a unilateral U.S.-determined settlement with no recognition of Palestinian national rights. That's the way it works. Those who cannot master these skills must seek another profession. There are many other examples. Take the term special interest. The well-oiled Republican PR systems of the 1980s regularly accused the Democrats of being the party of the special interests, women, labor, the elderly, the young, farmers, in short, the general population. There was only one sector of the population never listed as a special interest: corporations and business generally. That makes sense. In PC discourse, their special interests are the national interest, to which all must bow. The Democrats plaintively retorted that they were not the party of the special interests, they served the national interest too. That was correct, but their problem has been that they lack the single-minded class consciousness of their Republican opponents. The latter are not confused about their role as representatives of the owners and managers of the society, who are fighting a bitter class war against the general population, often adopting vulgar Marxist rhetoric and concepts, resorting to jingoist hysteria, fear and terror, awe of great leaders, and other standard devices of population control. The Democrats are less clear about their allegiances, hence less effective in the propaganda wars. Finally, take the term conservative, which has come to refer to advocates of a powerful state, which interferes massively in the economy and in social life. They advocate huge state expenditures and a post-war peak of protectionist measures and insurance against market risk, narrowing individual liberties through legislation and court packing, protecting the holy state from unwarranted inspection by the irrelevant citizenry, in short, those programs that are the precise opposite of traditional conservatism. Their allegiance is to the people who own the country, and therefore ought to govern it, in the words of Founding Father John Jay. It's really not that hard, once one understands the rules. To make sense of political discourse, it's necessary to give a running translation into English, decoding the doublespeak of the media, academic social scientists, and the secular priesthood generally. Its function is not obscure. The effect is to make it impossible to find words to talk about matters of human significance in a coherent way. We can then be sure that little will be understood about how our society works and what is happening in the world. A major contribution to democracy, in the PC sense of the word. Socialism, real and fake. One can debate the meaning of the term a socialism, but if it means anything, it means control of production by the workers themselves, not owners and managers who rule them and control all decisions, whether in capitalist enterprises or an absolutist state. To refer to the Soviet Union as socialist is an interesting case of doctrinal doublespeak. The Bolshevik coup of October 1917 placed state power in the hands of Lenin and Trotsky, who moved quickly to dismantle the incipient socialist institutions that had grown up during the Popular Revolution of the preceding months, the factory councils, the Soviets, in fact any organ of popular control, and to convert the workforce into what they called a labor army, under the command of the leader. In any meaningful sense of the term a socialism, the Bolsheviks moved at once to destroy its existing elements. No socialist deviation has been permitted since. These developments came as no surprise to leading Marxist intellectuals, who had criticized Lenin's doctrines for years, as had Trotsky, because they would centralize authority in the hands of the vanguard party and its leaders. In fact, decades earlier, the anarchist thinker Bakunin had predicted that the emerging intellectual class would follow one of two paths. Either they would try to exploit popular struggles to take state power themselves, becoming a brutal and oppressive red bureaucracy, or they would become the managers and ideologists of the state capitalist societies if popular revolution failed. It was a perceptive insight on both counts. The world's two major propaganda systems did not agree on much, but they did agree on using the term socialism to refer to the immediate destruction of every element of socialism by the Bolsheviks. That's not too surprising. The Bolsheviks called their system socialist so as to exploit the moral prestige of socialism. The West adopted the same usage for the opposite reason, to defame the feared libertarian ideals by associating them with the Bolshevik dungeon, to undermine the popular belief that there really might be progress towards a more just society with democratic control over its basic institutions and concern for human needs and rights. If socialism is the tyranny of Lenin and Stalin, then sane people will say, not for me. And if that's the only alternative to corporate state capitalism, then many will submit to its authoritarian structures as the only reasonable choice. With the collapse of the Soviet system, there's an opportunity to revive the lively and vigorous libertarian socialist thought that was not able to withstand the doctrinal and repressive assaults of the major systems of power. How large a hope that is, we cannot know. But at least one roadblock has been removed. In that sense, the disappearance of the Soviet Union is a small victory for socialism, much as the defeat of the fascist powers was. The media. Whether they're called liberal or conservative, the major media are large corporations, owned by and interlinked with even larger conglomerates. Like other corporations, they sell a product to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. The product is audiences. For the elite media that set the basic agenda to which others adapt, the product is, furthermore, relatively privileged audiences. So we have major corporations selling fairly wealthy and privileged audiences to other businesses. Not surprisingly, the picture of the world presented reflects the narrow and biased interests and values of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Other factors reinforce the same distortion. The cultural managers, editors, leading columnists, etc., share class interests and associations with state and business managers and other privileged sectors. There is, in fact, a regular flow of high-level people among corporations, government, and media. Access to state authorities is important to maintain a competitive position. Leaks, for example, are often fabrications and deceit produced by the authorities with the cooperation of the media, who pretend they don't know. In return, state authorities demand cooperation and submissiveness. Other power centers also have devices to punish departures from orthodoxy, ranging from the stock market to an effective vilification and defamation apparatus. The outcome is not, of course, entirely uniform. To serve the interests of the powerful, the media must present a tolerably realistic picture of the world. And professional integrity and honesty sometimes interfere with the overriding mission. The best journalists are, typically, quite aware of the factors that shape the media product and seek to use such openings as are provided. The result is that one can learn a lot by a critical and skeptical reading of what the media produce. The media are only one part of a larger doctrinal system. Other parts are journals of opinion, the schools and universities, academic scholarship, and so on. We're much more aware of the media, particularly the prestige media, because those who critically analyze ideology have focused on them. The larger system hasn't been studied as much because it's harder to investigate systematically. But there's a good reason to believe that it represents the same interests as the media, just as one would anticipate. The doctrinal system, which produces what we call propaganda when discussing enemies, has two distinct targets. One target is what's sometimes called the political class, the roughly 20% of the population that's relatively educated, more or less articulate, playing some role in decision-making. Their acceptance of doctrine is crucial because they're in a position to design and implement policy. Then there's the other 80% or so of the population. These are Lippmann's spectators of action, whom he referred to as the bewildered herd. They are supposed to follow orders and keep out of the way of the important people. They're the target of the real mass media, the tabloids, the sitcoms, the Super Bowl, and so on. These sectors of the doctrinal system serve to divert the unwashed masses and reinforce the basic social values: passivity, submissiveness to authority, the overriding virtue of greed and personal gain, lack of concern for others, fear of real or imagined enemies, etc. The goal is to keep the bewildered herd bewildered. It's unnecessary for them to trouble themselves with what's happening in the world. In fact, it's undesirable. If they see too much of reality, they may set themselves to change it. That's not to say that the media can't be influenced by the general population. The dominant institutions, whether political, economic, or doctrinal, are not immune to public pressures. Independent, alternative media can also play an important role. Though they lack resources, almost by definition, they gain significance in the same way that popular organizations do, by bringing together people with limited resources who can multiply their effectiveness and their understanding through their interactions, precisely the democratic threat that's so feared by dominant elites.